I'm Scott Allen Miller. It's the 8th of December, 2023. This is my vlog of daily life living in Leon, Nicaragua. A couple days ago, we talked about why stability in countries is not something you really need to worry about in most cases, and when you are going to worry about it, you need to think about it differently than most people do, and you need to kind of give no credence to warnings of one country about instability in another. Wars are different, but just instability is a very loose concept. If you haven't seen that episode, take a moment, go back and watch that. We're going to do a bump here in just a second, so it's a perfect time to pause it, watch that one, and we're going to talk about how you need to be prepared for issues that people generally associate with instability, no matter where you live. So go watch that, and I'll see you right after the bump. What we really worry about in most countries, whether we're an expat, a digital nomad, a tourist, or living in our home country, is different than stability. Rarely is governmental stability something that we actually care about. Even in our home country, while it may make us mad that something we don't like is happening, or we don't like the process by which a change is occurring, that's not something we normally need to flee about or be prepared for. It could be, it does happen, but in general, it's something different. And once in a while, instability is tied with something else. But let's talk about what we really have to worry about. What we really need to worry about is violence, uprisings, insurrections, possibly wars and invasions. There are things that will happen that make you potentially want to flee any given country. And every country in the world runs some risks from this. It doesn't matter if you're the US or China or Russia or South Africa or Paraguay or Uganda, there's an opportunity for something terrible to happen in your country, and maybe or maybe not that's tied to instability in the government. It's kind of irrelevant. The point is, the world can be a little bit of a scary place from time to time, and once in a while, it may behoove you to grab your stuff and go. As an expat, one of the risks that you generally run, or a digital nomad or a tourist, is that you may not have a solid plan in place for what to do when you're in another country. And for people who are not expats or traveling, it's often tempting to think, well, I've never had to do anything like that in my home country. I don't need to be prepared for it unless I'm traveling. So in both cases, we have something that lulls us into a sense of security. One is just we're not thinking about it, and the other is we're sure we don't have to worry about it, because honestly, it doesn't happen very often. It's a very rare thing. When I lived in the United States, I lived in Texas for the last many years, and when I had children, I was much more prepared than before I did. When I didn't have children, I didn't worry about things. There was always some way that you could survive in case of a disaster. I also lived in the quiet Northeast, where things are much safer. Living in Texas made it very apparent that we sometimes had really risky weather situations, like massive tornadoes and hurricanes, that did regularly require people to evacuate. Generally not very far. You're not worried about a border in those cases, but you are worried about what traffic's going to be like in case of a massive disaster. You are worried about how you're going to get places. Will you have enough fuel? Will you have enough water? Because entire, like, millions and millions of people, areas much larger than Central America could have, or individual Central American countries could have things like water systems and sewage systems collapse, and you may be looking at widespread disease problems and so forth. Or you could just be having crocodiles in your local water supply. All kinds of crazy things. So these are things you actually start worrying about when you live in Texas. Plus, Texas is much more given to the risk of an uprising than New York is, and even more so, Texas is a strategic area where it is assumed, in the case of a full-on invasion of the United States or a full-on nuclear-class war, that Texas will not be the first target, but it will be an early one, specifically the port of Houston, which is a really important energy source for the United States and its allies. So Houston is a key strategic point that a foreign power may target, not as soon as they would target Louisiana, for example, which is where most of the United States nuclear arsenal is housed. That is considered the absolute starting point of any major scale war, but Houston will be soon after. And while Houston was not a place that we lived, any massive disaster there would cut us off from most of our escape routes. So when we lived in Texas and had children, something that we always had was go bags ready by the door, and we had a plan of evacuation. We didn't think we would ever have to use it, but it was important to have, whether it was a political uprising in the US, which looks pretty risky in the 10-year period, almost certainly going to happen, or whether it's a foreign war that spills over into the US borders, which seems less likely but certainly plausible. All those things gave us pause and that maybe we should take a moment and have a plan. So we did. We had go bags ready to go. Our children knew exactly what to do in case we had to leave in an emergency. My family, who was far away, all knew exactly what we would do, and we had a plan to get everyone in a car as fast as we could and get on the road and race to the Mexican border in the hopes that we'd be able to cross the frontera before they shut it down from the influx of Americans trying to get out of the southern United States. All we were worried about, it's like with a bear. I don't have to outrun the bear. I just have to outrun all of you. And that was our strategy. Make sure we got to the border in that first group so that we were allowed in, even if there was a long line at the border. And once we were in, hightail it for Monterrey, where we'd be able to take a moment to pause, possibly find lodging, definitely be able to make phone calls and let family know that we had safely made it out of the country, and from there make decisions whether we were heading to southern Mexico, staying for 6 months and making a decision from there, crossing the frontier into the Central American states and looking to stay there long term. This is before we were living in Nicaragua, but we knew how to live in Nicaragua, and it was on our preparedness list of things we may do. We may go to Mexico, we may go into Central America, come to Nicaragua. Long term we ended up doing anyway, or we may have continued on to Panama, who would automatically give us 180 days as well at the time and get us even farther away. And we had really close friends, still have really close friends in Panama, where at the time we didn't have as many resources in Nicaragua. It felt like the logical thing maybe to make it to Panama, where there would be people who'd be able to help us find housing or whatever. Plus we had lived there previously in addition to Nicaragua, so we have a lot of familiarity there. So we had plans with 3 really reasonable country options and several less reasonable ones, everything ready. We knew exactly where we were going to make phone calls, where we were going to have to get fuel, all those things. And it was just a little bit of planning that gave us a lot of comfort. And my family knew, our family in New York, who are not in a nuclear blast zone, are able to say, okay, if something ever goes wrong, all we have to do is wait this many hours, look at the border crossing times, and know that they're probably going to call us from Monterrey, and we'll know that they are safe. Don't have to really worry before that. That kind of preparation can be pretty important. When you're living abroad, it's easy to be like, well, what are the chances of things? I'm not here for that long, whatever, or just forget about it. But you're more likely to have to deal with it because you're a foreigner, right? Because you also have to worry about not just things that would make it unsafe for you to stay, but there could be, very unlikely, extremely unlikely, but more likely than nuclear war, is that something will happen and you may have to quickly leave due to a change in political situation. This does not necessarily mean government instability. It could be a sudden change of a very stable government's opinion on foreigners, or maybe you do something that makes you persona non grata and you need to leave for personal reasons. I know people who've had this happen. These things do happen from time to time. So if you're going to be living anywhere, home country, anywhere, it's good to have a plan. And thanks to Bill for bringing this up. We were talking about instability, and it's important. You shouldn't be worried about instability. These are not things you should be thinking about in the way that it's presented. But you should have plans, and that way it's even more that you don't have to worry about instability because you're ready. So we're going to use Nicaragua as an example because I live here, and a lot of you are interested in Nicaragua, but these same logical steps are going to apply to anybody, right? Anywhere you are, you should have some plan. What are you going to do in case of a number of different things? And you can't plan for everything, so don't go crazy, but have some basic things down. For example, we know we have a car and that we can drive out of the area that we're in. We're relatively trapped because we live on the far side of a city, so we don't have access to a whole bunch of different roads. We have to get through the city before we can even make any decisions. So our first step of anything happening is deciding, are we hunkering down where we are? Do we have access to food, water, power, whatever's needed for however long we think we need to wait out whatever's happening? Or do we need to potentially get out of the country? Okay, so let's assume we've made the decision we have to get out of the country, or at least out of the area that we're in. Maybe it's a giant tidal wave that's coming, and we race for the city. You want to have go bags ready or some ability to pack extremely quickly, just a few minutes. If it's a tidal wave situation, we really wouldn't get a tidal wave here. That would be beyond ridiculous. We would lose huge portions of the country. There would be such widespread disaster. You probably wouldn't want to survive if a tidal wave hit where we are here, but if we were on the beach, certainly you want to be ready for tidal waves. And so you want to be able to pack. You want to be able to get people in the car and move quickly, get to the far side of the city. For us, from there, we can make decisions. We have roughly 30 minutes, even if nothing happens, to get through the city and make decisions. Are we going north to Honduras, or are we going south into the rest of Nicaragua or on to Costa Rica? Those are only 2 borders that we can get to. Or do we have to get to the airport that exists today, or potentially the future airport that's being constructed? All of those are or will be options, and it depends on what type of situation is going on. Is it purely a political one and we just need to get out in the next 72 hours? You probably want to use the airport. Is it something where we feel that there is some safety issue? Well, we probably want to cross a border relatively quickly. Where is that instability coming from? Is it coming from an internal factor or a insurge of refugees that are suddenly racing the border? That would almost certainly come from Costa Rica, as it often does. What if it is a armed invasion of the country? Almost certainly that would come from the north, as it has in the past. Those are unlikely scenarios in all cases, but you have to evaluate what's going on and make some decisions. Under most conditions, most things that would cause a disaster, we would be racing to the north. The border is less than 2 hours away, especially if you're in a panic, you can get there pretty quickly. That is the Honduran border. That gives us 2 hours in a car to make a decision. Is Honduras going to be adequate? Do we need to keep moving further on? Getting to El Salvador is only an additional 2 hours. It depends exactly what's going on, what you're going to want to do. And we can just make plans. Where do we want to find a place to stay long term? The farther away you get from a zone where people are evacuating, the more readily available housing will be. Do we want to go on to Guatemala? And of course, do we want to drive on to Mexico, where you have a completely different political barrier, right? It's very important. The three countries to the north are politically part of the border zone with Nicaragua. They are sovereign states, but they share a lot of things. So anything that's happening here, there's a fair chance it could be happening there as well, whatever that thing is. So we have to be aware that maybe we're heading into an area that we may want to get out of pretty quickly. So knowing that Mexico or Belize, which are two very different political entities that are not that far away, do exist as options. Belize makes you very physically constrained, so generally you wouldn't go that direction. But if you're hoping that the British government will evacuate you due to their membership in the Commonwealth, then that may play into the factors. And if you are a British citizen, then certainly Belize becomes a very useful location for you, whereas as an American or as a Canadian it would as well. As an American it's much less so. You might as well just get to Mexico. You'll have resources closer and faster. Mexico itself is a giant zone that can protect against the most things that would affect someone else in the region. They have a lot of military, they have a lot of resources, they have a lot of economy. So whether it's a zombie apocalypse or whatever, Mexico is likely to have a very different situation than here. And so for a lot of people, just getting to Mexico or in the other direction to Panama gives you the flexibility you need for whatever may be happening. Having those plans, being ready to go, doesn't mean you have to put anything into action. It doesn't mean that you should be creating a panic. It doesn't mean that you should be worrying about these things, but you should have some thought processes. You should not be at the moment that something happens and you suddenly panic, or someone tells you something and you don't know what's happening, so you decide to panic anyway. That happens, right? What are you going to do? Knowing Honduras is close, what is the path to get there? You don't have to look at a map. From here, we know we drive to Toluca. It's easiest to take the turn at Toluca, then turn and go around the volcano, straight up to Guasale. It's that easy. What do you have to have for the border? Just your passport. You'll be good to go. You can go right across. You don't have to give them warning. There's all these things, right? Just know these basics, have them down, and with a couple minutes of research, with a few minutes of planning, with a little bit of discussing with your family or whoever you live with or whoever you're going to travel with, and you can have all your plans in place and have a great deal of protection and not have to worry about those things in the future. I have absolutely no anticipation that I will ever have to use a plan like that. And I'm willing to live in some pretty risky places, and have, right? When I was in Macedonia, we had an uprising and we did have an overthrow of the government, or a relatively peaceful transfer of government that was sudden and unexpected. And it was so unexpected that when we got to the border in the morning, which we made the judgment call, we don't have to flee in the middle of the night, we don't have to panic, but we should not extend our stay. We should pack up the car, drive to the Serbian border, and head back to Romania, where we were living at the time. And that was the logical thing to do. When we got to the Serbian border, a lot of people had made the same decision, and Serbia had no idea what was going on, and so had a really long wait at the border, as no one was working border control that morning. They had like one guy who was like, why are there thousands of cars? But that was a very handy, we didn't panic, we knew what to do, and just made the decision that it was best to head to the next jurisdiction. As an expat or as a digital nomad, as someone who is a bit more flexible, that it's not your home country, these things become a lot easier in most cases. If you're Nicaraguan and suddenly had to leave the country, that can be a challenge. You may need a visa. You can always try asylum at the border. You can beg to get over, but it's officially more difficult. There may be any number of things that may make it difficult for you to cross that border, depending on which one you have to go to. As an American or Canadian or Western European, chances are you can just go to any border you want in this region and simply drive across crossed. Or if you need a visa, you can do it at the border without a problem. You don't have some pre-approval process or anything like that. Those do exist, but they're few and far between. Venezuela, Bolivia, Brazil, but none of those have land borders with this region. So in this region, you're in really great shape. If you're living in Colombia on the eastern border and Venezuela is the only place you can go, that may be a bit more difficult. You may have to accommodate that that's a hard border that you may not be allowed to cross. That's just how things are. You need to be aware of what your passport strengths and what your visa situation is for your options. But by having all those things, you can have this comfort of just, I don't have to panic, because if something happens, this is what I'm going to do. Here's when I'm going to make decisions. And if you feel that that's something you can't remember, write it down. Just have a slip of paper in the car, in the glove box, that says, okay, head to here, turn here. You've got an hour while driving, make this decision. Everyone in the car talk about what factors are going on. This is your time to decompress and think while you're driving. Get to the border and maybe make the decision that, oh, you panicked, you don't need to leave the country, turn around before you get to the border, and it was just a sudden morning drive, stop and get some coffee and breakfast and head back home. Whatever. That planning is an important step, no matter where you are, no matter what you're doing, but it is important to do. It is a safety tool, and it's something that is just way too overlooked. So thank you to Bill for bringing that up. Please take a moment and do that. If you have questions about what kind of planning maybe you should do, what kind of things should you consider, where are you, what would you do, like, get down to those comments, let me know. Certainly it's worth discussing. I'd love to get into that, or if nothing else, just jump down there and say hi. As always, you can buy me a coffee to support the channel. That's buymeacoffee.com/Scott Alan Miller. It'll be linked up there. That comes directly to me and helps make all of this show possible. And thank you so much to all the new people. This past week, we've had just an explosive week for sure. We've had a number of episodes that got a lot of attention. Thank you so much to Eric, who came and did the show with me. That's done a lot to get attention. The events going on in Venezuela and Guyana has done a lot to get attention this week. And it's been a good week around here and exciting. I'm glad to be able to bring this to you. So thank you to all of our supporters, whether you're just watching and giving us a like, or you're actually going on Buy Me a Coffee and making a donation. Every bit is very much appreciated. Thank you to everyone who comes. And you can always support the channel if you need by just watching another episode, hitting like on that, telling your friends, posting on social media. Thank you for doing that. And I will see all of you tomorrow.